I am Amy Schrank, the Extension Program Leader with Minnesota Sea Grant. And working with me on this project is Dan Larkin, who's at the University of Minnesota in the Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology Department. And we have two grad fellows on this project, Brendan Nee and Mike Tuma, who you'll meet a little later in the talk. So first, I want to start with what a healthy nearshore ecosystem should look like. And that is what this photo is showing you. So you can see lots of different plants along the shoreline. You can see a few cattail here maybe. And as you look across the water, you see this brown top plant, which is bulrush. Bulrush has been historically the sort of dominant plant in Minnesota ecosystems in the nearshore zone. So nearshore meaning, or emergent zone, meaning they're rooted in the sediment and they grow out of the sediment into the air. And then as you move further into the water, you see floating leaf plants. And of course, we also will have some submerged plants. So if we move down into sort of the frog's eye view here, you can see that these plants are all mixed together. So this is what creates a healthy coastal ecosystem. You have narrow bulrushes that are emergent and a mix of floating leaf plants as well. So it's this heterogeneity that's important. There's some vegetated areas, there's some open areas, plants sharing space. And if we move down to the fisheye view, of course, you see some submergent plants here. And you see that these narrow stems of bulrushes allow even schooling species like minnows to swim through them. It's not super dense, yet they still provide predation from fish predators and also from avian predators. So we also know these nearshore ecosystems are super important spawning and nursery areas for all different kinds of fishes. You see some larval fish and some small fish here. We also know that a lot of small-bodied fish spend their entire lives in these vegetated zones. So these are examples of 4 different minnow species. Minnows are a family of fishes, in case you don't know that. And they are super important as forage fishes for the larger species we might think of more as humans, the game fish we might care a little bit more about. So most fishes rely on vegetated nearshore zones at some point in their lives. So these are critical areas for fish communities. What's been happening along shorelines in Minnesota and really throughout the Great Lakes region is instead of that nice heterogeneous habitat with lots of different plant species and plant physical forms, we end up becoming dominated by hybrid cattail, which causes this homogenization, and that's what you see here. So instead of those variety of plants, you see sort of this big monoculture of hybrid cattail. It's very dense. It displaces native plants, and it really changes not only the physical habitat, but also the ecological community. So to back up a little bit, in case you're not clear about what a hybrid cattail is, we do have a native cattail in Minnesota called the broadleaf cattail, Typha latifolia. And we also have a narrow-leaf cattail, which is non-native. It came from Europe, called Typha angustifolia. People are always wondering how to tell these apart. So just to give you a brief primer here, you can see where the arrows are. The male flowering part of the plant is this sort of yellow spiky part on top. The female flowering plant is what sometimes people call the catkin, that brown puffy part. And in our native species, these two parts of the plant are really close together, maybe even just a few millimeters. So it looks like they're touching. It also has a wider leaf, but you really can't tell leaf size unless you're looking at both species together. And then if you look at the narrowleaf cattail, you can see that there's a big space between the male flowering part of the plant and the female part of the plant. Note, you can really only tell this when these plants are flowering. So that's usually in, early to midsummer. And then the male part of the flower falls off. So this looks pretty simple, but the problem happens when both of these species co-occur in the same range. They always hybridized. So instead of these distinct species, you actually get this hybrid. These are harder to tell apart. So hybrid cattail is called Typha ex glauca. And when I'm talking about cattail for the rest of this talk, that's what I'll be talking about. So you can see that you get a lot of variability between that male and female part of the plant. And in some stems, you'll see that they almost touch. So you really have to be careful about identification. It's really actually quite difficult to do in the field. If you see how the cattail is growing, hybrid cattail tends to grow in these giant monocultures. They really do take over lake shores pretty aggressively, more aggressively than either of those parents. But it can be difficult to tell apart. So how long has it been here? That's another question that often people have. And I like this map from Sugalatowicz et al. In 1999, which shows the range of Typha ex glauca. And what's interesting here is sort of the early range of this hybrid cattail. So if you look at this dark line on the East Coast in 1860, indicating that before 1860, there really aren't any records of hybrid cattail. They were only along the coastline, right? So there were records, but they were just along the coast. And that comes from old herbarium records and also historic soil cores. So you can reconstruct what vegetation existed by looking at pollen grains in the soil. So they see this hybrid cattail starting in the mid 1800s, and you can see this lobe of sort of checkerboard in 1949. That's stretched all the way to this red star, and that is Minnesota. So you can see that hybrid cattail has been in Minnesota since late 40s, right? So it's been here a long time. People don't always recognize it as an invasive species because it looks very similar to sort of our iconic cattail that everybody thinks about in wetlands. And as you look at these other cross-hatched regions here, you can see that it's spreading. As you can see, this is an older map. So if you look at a more recent range map, it really has spread all around North America. So it's been here a long time, makes it kind of a cryptic invader. And the consequence of that is we're never going to completely get rid of it. So that's something important to think about going forward. So just to give you an example of what happens with hybrid cattail, I'm going to show you a couple of aerial photos. So this is a photo of Jackfish Bay on Rainy Lake. So this bay has a bunch of these islands. You can see here, the black is water. That's the lake itself. And these islands are connected by these causeways, these roads. And they weren't super careful about making sure water would flow, between these islands or through these causeways. So that kind of really changed the water level and water flow. So this aerial photo is from 1972, and I'm going to show you the exact same photo from 2020. And what you see is all this brown that has filled in is hybrid cattail. So once they sort of changed that water flow, and that allowed hybrid cattail to get a foothold, and now they're really struggling with it and trying to make some plans to remove some of it. So this is what's happened on a lot of lake shores in Minnesota and in the region. So just basic cattail biology. Cattail reproduce by wind dispersed seeds like many other wetland plants do. You've probably seen those puffy seeds blowing away in the fall. They also can reproduce clonally with a rhizome. Again, this is not uncommon. Other wetland plants do this. There's nothing really super special about the way cattail reproduce. This is showing you a sort of clone of cattail that we pulled out of the sediment. The rhizome is what connects these stems together. And if you were to cut that rhizome at that arrow, for example, it could shoot out another root and then put up another stem. So that's how it reproduces clonally. So that's really just one plant. So again, other cattail do this, so do bulrush. Lots of species reproduce this way. So that's not really what makes hybrid cattail so invasive. So what is the deal? Why does it tend to take over? And the reason that's most often cited is just basically hybrid vigor or heterosis. So the idea here is that the parents of two species produce offspring that's a little bit more fit for that environment than either of those parent species. And so that seems to be the case with hybrid cattail. That it's just an offspring that tends to do really well to the detriment of some of our other native plant species. So a few characteristics about hybrid cattail, just so you can sort of see what the consequences are. It has a really rapid growth rate, more than either of its parent species. It grows taller, and you can see that in this photo here. This is actually a nearshore Lake Huron. This is some sedges, some native vegetation, and you see this darker green plant is cattail, hybrid cattail. So it's very tall. It's usually taller than your tallest technician, so it's very easy to get lost in when you're walking around in it. It produces larger clones, so it spreads out more broadly than either of its parent species. Consequently, there's a lot more biomass accumulation. So that just means both live and dead cattail. So all that live cattail is happy and growing in the summer. It dies down in the winter and gets packed down. And that causes a lot of suppression of other native plant species. Then more biomass grows up the next year. So it's this biomass, or what we call leaf litter, that can be a problem for cattail. It's also tolerant of a wide range of water levels. So it can grow in pretty deep water, deeper than either of its parent species, and also really shallow water. It does really well when we regulate water to make it, not real high and not real low. So when we manage water levels, that's really good for cattail. It prefers nutrient-rich systems like many species, and it's tolerant of salt as well. So some of the early work we did on cattail in the Great Lakes, we compared non-invaded nearshore lake regions to cattail invaded regions. And what we found is that when cattail invades, you see reduced dissolved oxygen in these areas, reduced plant diversity, reduced fish abundance, and reduced fish diversity. So generally, hybrid cattail is not so great for a nearshore lake ecosystem. So, and we know that from the Great Lakes. So our question then for the work I'm going to talk to you about today is, how can we manage hybrid cattail to help mitigate these negative effects? What can we do about this? So that's sort of the big picture question that our work is asking. So we have a few choices when we think about management. We can spray with herbicide, as you see in this top picture. We can burn it. Both of these have some non-target effects. So for example, neither of those methods are they're kind of bad for larval fishes or amphibians. It's hard to burn when you have a really populated lake. That doesn't always work that well. You can mow it from the surface, or you can cut it below the water. And so we chose cutting it below the water as the management strategy we wanted to test out. You can see some examples of some folks doing this in the Great Lakes region. And the reason we chose this is because we learned that when we open up some of this dense cattail, it turns out that native plants will grow back. So the seeds of wetland vegetation or nearshore vegetation stay in that sediment for multiple years and are viable for a long time. So when you remove that cattail biomass and open up that water, you allow the sun to reach the sediment again, those plants will grow back. So that seemed like a good prospect for us. The reason that happens is because cattail, like other wetland species, have holes in their stems. So this is a cross section of cattail, and those holes allow oxygen to efficiently move to the roots so that that plant can be rooted in an anoxic soil. So that's kind of a unique aspect of wetland plants. So when you zoom out across lakes in Minnesota, you'll see that we do this all the time, right? We open up these channels to get our boats into the water, to allow access for swimming to open water, or even just for view. So we're already doing this. We're already removing plants to have access to the open water. And our question really is, does mechanical harvesting of cattails benefit nearshore plant and fish communities in inland lakes? So are the things that we're already doing and that landowners could do on an individual scale, does that provide some restoration benefit? And if so, how? So that's sort of the overall question of our study. And these are the lakes we asked that question in. So we had 9 lakes. The northernmost lakes were Rainy and Cabotogama up in Voyageurs National Park, and our southernmost lakes were down here near the Twin Cities, Coon Lake and Big Marine. And we used a specific experimental design called a BACI design, which stands for before after control impact, which I'll explain to you a minute in the next slide. But the idea is we went to each lake. This is an example from Big Marine, and we chose 2 sites or 2 plots, a control site where we did not remove cattail, and then a cattail removal site. And what we wanted to do was measure the variables that we cared about at these 2 sites, both before and after cattail removal. So cattail removal was our impact in this study. And you can see here, this is just an aerial example of what those sites might look like. And you can see these are our researchers right here. And this is Big Marine Lake. You can see all back here, the vegetation is cattail. So there's quite a bit of cattail growing in there. So I wanted to give you a timeline of our study. And in summer 2021, we went to all of our lakes and both of our sites. And remember, this was before cattail removal. And we measured water quality, plant community, and fishes before we removed cattail. We removed cattail in the fall of 2021. And then in summer 2022, we went back and measured water quality, plants, and fishes post cattail removal. So pretty straightforward design for this project. And what I want to do then is show you some of our data and sort of summarize the results we found from our work. So you might remember that I mentioned that dissolved oxygen is one of the things we saw that is reduced in the presence of cattails relative to a native nearshore zone. So I have some data to show you here. So on the y-axis, we have mean dissolved oxygen, so just how much oxygen is in the water. And on the x-axis, we have time of day, so 6 in the morning to about 4 in the afternoon. And I'm showing you first data from 2021, which is before we remove cattail. And you'll see our retained site where the cattail will be retained is in orange and our removed site is in blue. But again, this is before removal. And so what you see here is that like these dots overlap a lot, right? So these are just all of our dissolved oxygen measurements. You can see generally that dissolved oxygen increases throughout the day, and I'll explain that in a second. But the conclusion from this graph is really that these lines are not significantly different, right? There's the same relationship with dissolved oxygen and time of day at both of our sites, and that's what we hope to see. We chose our sites to make sure that they were as similar as possible before we remove cattail. So I'm going to show you the same graph here after removing cattail. So again, dissolved oxygen on the Y, time of day on the X. What you see here is that, we still see that increasing relationship. With dissolved oxygen increasing throughout the day. But what you can see is this, while the slopes of these lines are the same, their intercepts, where they actually intercept this y-axis, are statistically different. So what that means is we're seeing more dissolved oxygen, maybe a milligram per liter more, in the cattail removed sites in blue compared to the cattail retained sites in orange. So somehow removing that cattail is allowing more oxygen into those nearshore zones. Oxygen is super important for fishes. Some fishes are more tolerant than others. So when you lose oxygen, you tend to lose fish species. So I wanted to just describe how oxygen changes during the day. I think this is an important thing to know about a nearshore lake zone or a wetland. So this is just a general idea of what happens with oxygen, and then I'll explain to you what I think is happening with cattail. So on the y-axis here, we have dissolved oxygen concentration, again, in the water column. And on the x-axis, we have time of day. So dawn, dusk, dawn, right? Pretty straightforward. And you can see the general pattern of oxygen is it's low in the early morning, it increases throughout the day, and then at dusk, it turns over, decreases again. The reason for that is you have photosynthesis occurring during the day, right? Because it needs sun. So things like algae and things like plants are producing oxygen. So that tends to steadily increase. And we're talking about in a sort of nearshore vegetated area, right? So not out in the middle of the lake, but really when you have dense vegetation. This is true in wetlands as well. And then in the, like once the sun goes down, at night, you have no photosynthesis occurring because you have no light, but you have respiration and decomposition. So that's using oxygen up. So the result of that is you get an oxygen low right at dawn. So that makes sense, right? We saw the pattern in our data that oxygen's low and then it increases throughout the day. So you can see here that one of the reasons oxygen increases throughout the day is because of photosynthesis. I think the other reason oxygen increases throughout the day is that out in the open water zone, you do have some oxygen-rich water out there. There's a lot of diffusion from the surface, and maybe there's wave action that's causing that to be pretty high in oxygen. And so wave action is bringing that oxygen-rich water into these nearshore zones. And so if you have an open zone with like bulrushes and not a ton of vegetation, that oxygen-rich water can get in there pretty quickly. But when you have a really dense cattail region, those waves don't propagate into those interiors. So it tends to be slower to increase oxygen during the day. It still does increase, but it just increases more slowly than these open zones because you have to wait for example, photosynthesis to catch up. So we think this is what's happening is that cattails sort of disconnect the open water from the nearshore zone. So it'll be interesting to monitor that over a number of years. So what did we find in terms of plants, plant growth? We did see more plants, right? So this is Mike Tuma, one of our grad students who was working on the plant portion of the project. You can see him here with his quadrat monitoring vegetation in one of our cattail cuts or cattail removed sites. And looking down at one of his plots, you can see that, in fact, we see submerged plants growing. We see some floating leaf plants as well. And so I'm going to just show you one graph from here. And you'll see some graphs that look like this. So I'm going to walk you through it so you can follow my next few graphs as well. So on the y-axis here, we have mean submerged vegetation in percent cover. So what percent, we use a quadrat and estimate percent cover of vegetation. And submerged just means it's growing below the water. And I'm going to show you the retained sites in orange and cattail removed sites in blue. And remember, cattail removal occurred between 2021 and 2022. So you can see my little diagram there for a reminder. In 2021, we saw not a ton, less than 10% submerged vegetation cover. And what you see is that they're not different. Those sites aren't different. So that's what we expected. We expected to see, similar vegetation cover in both of our sites because we chose our sites to be as similar as possible. And then we removed cattail, and now we can compare the retained in orange and the removed in blue. And we see that in our removed sites, there is significantly more submerged aquatic vegetation than in our retained sites. So this is what we were hoping to see, right? We didn't do any active reseeding. We just removed cattail, and we did see increased plant growth. And these are data for all of our 9 lakes combined. So what about the fishes? We sampled fishes using minnow traps. It's hard to sample fishes in dense cattail, but minnow traps work well. We're talking about small fishes, right? Because those are small traps. And I'm going to show you some data here from one lake. So this is Lake Maud, um, sort of northwest central part of Minnesota, northwest part of Minnesota. And I'm showing you what's called mean catch per unit effort here on the y-axis. It's just a measure of fish abundance, so how many fish there are. The unit is fish per trap per night, but it's just essentially how many fish we have. Remember, we remove cattail where the green arrow is. And we can see that in 2021, these two bars are similar. The error bars and all these graphs are two standard errors from the mean if you're interested in that. But what they show is that when those error bars overlap, we don't see any statistical difference between those two bars. So fish abundance was pretty much the same before we removed cattail. After we removed cattail, again, we're comparing here the retained and the removed. We see significantly more fish in our removed site in Lake Maud than our retained site. So that's what we hypothesize. That's what we hope to find. But I want to also now show you all of the lakes together, the data all combined. And with all of the combined data, we really don't see quite the difference that we do when we look on an individual lake by lake basis, because some of these lakes we didn't see tons of difference. So here you can see same fish abundance on the y-axis, and you can see that in 2021, not really a difference. In 2022, also not really a difference, despite us removing cattail at one of those sites. So what we suspect is happening, first recall that this is the first summer that we removed first summer after we removed cattail, but we suspect that sometimes you might not see the difference in the fish abundance or the number of fish that are there, but you might see the difference in the types of fish that were there. So it could be that the community is shifting. And we do have some data that show that. So here I'm showing you kind of a Venn diagram. I'll walk you through it here. The orange circle is our cattail retained sites, and the blue circle is our cattail removed sites. So I'm going to throw some fish species up there and show you what we caught in each type of plot. So there are no fish species that we caught in the retained that we didn't also see in the removed plots. So this part of the Venn diagram kind of always stays blank. But we did see a number of different types of fish species in both the retained and removed plots, even post cattail removal. So I'm not going to read through all of these. They're color coded by family of fish. So you can see we saw a lot of bullheads, some mud minnows, a few northern pike, babies, of course, a few shiners, although not too many. So these are minnow species, the yellow. A banded killifish is kind of like a minnow, a different family, but similar size. We saw lots of centrarchids or sunfishes. So these were by and large the most dominant in these vegetated areas. And we did see a few yellow perch. So you can see we saw a lot of species in both types of plots. But there were also a few species we only saw in cattail removed plots once the cattail had been removed. So in particular, Johnny darter and Iowa darter. These are then we also I'm getting a message that my internet's unstable. So Maddie, if I'm breaking up, let me know. Anyway, so Johnny darter and Iowa darter only once cattail were removed, and I also we also saw one species of minnow that only in the removed plot after we removed cattail. So what this suggests is it does seem to be some community difference. We're seeing fishes in removed plots that we never see when cattail are present, and this is something I think we really need to keep track of over multiple years. The last data graph I want to show you is what happens with minnows overall. So in that previous slide, just flip up here, you see all these different minnow types in yellow. This graph is showing you all the minnow species as a whole. So again, we've got catch per unit effort, which as you remember, I'm sure, is a measure of fish abundance. So how many minnows overall there are. These are data across all 9 lakes. And again, same type of thing. I'm going to show you both the before and after. And what you see is these numbers on the y-axis, like 0.03, 0.05 fish per trap per night, are small, right? We didn't catch a lot of minnows overall. And you can see before we remove cattail, hardly any. And you can see there's lots of variability, which is why these error bars are really wide. When we remove cattail, we did see significantly more minnows in our cattail removed plots. So once the cattail was cut. I think this is an important finding. I think we need more data for this. We need to look over multiple years. But one of the interesting consequences of this is that minnows are probably the most important forage species for game fish, right? There's tons of baby sunfish, but those are really almost always inaccessible to game fish. Their strategy for anti-predator, for predator avoidance, is to hide in vegetation. Minnow species are school, so they swim together, but they tend to do so in more open habitats. They tend to be in the edges of vegetation. They don't venture into the deep water, but they are more accessible to game fish at the edge. So when people look at the stomachs of, for example, walleye, they tend to find mostly minnows, not baby sunfishes. So I think what's happening is that these really heavily vegetated cattail areas are not um, are not good for minnow species. So what happens is we kind of lose minnows, or they're moving where cattail did we find? We definitely saw that native plants increase when we remove cattails. We see that the fish community shifts. We see more minnows and darters and cattail removed plots, and we'll hopefully be collecting some more data to see, what this looks like, not just the first summer after cattail removal, but after, more summers after cattail removal. We saw that cattail removal is effective. It does seem to be effective in restoring these ecosystems, but water levels have a really big impact. And to sort of talk about this is a picture from Voyageurs National Park. You can see it's in the fall, right? You have yellow trees in the background. Rainy Lake is where this site was, and that's sort of a reservoir, right? The water is managed. So in the fall, the water level dropped below our cattail stems, right? And you can see these two things here are temperature loggers, which of course are supposed to be recording temperature underwater. But so this cattail was cut in the previous winter, or the previous fall. And what you can see here is that some of these stems are regrowing, right? So as soon as those stems become sort of out of the water, become unsubmerged, I guess, those stems can grow back. So we did have some cattail regrowth in some of our sites, partly because we happened to choose 2 years where we experienced historic drought and also historic flood. So water level is going to be a critical component of cattail removal, and something we'll really have to consider in the future. And we're hopeful too that our data will excuse me, inform the Minnesota DNR as they make landowner permitting decisions. So DNR has been a partner with us on this project. They really helped us find sites for this project, and they've been really supportive of us throughout this project. So, we'll be providing their data so that they can make management decisions. One thing to note is that currently in Minnesota, as a landowner, property owner on the lakeshore, you can apply for a aquatic plant management permit to remove a swath of vegetation from shoreline to open water that's 15 feet wide. Our cattail cuts were actually 30 feet wide from shoreline to open water because we wanted to see what happened when you sort of doubled the permitting width of these cattail removal plots. So we kind of used the current guidelines for cattail removal as a guide in choosing how wide our sites were. One really important component of our project has been and will continue to be public outreach. So the idea here is we're focusing on the importance of native plants to nearshore ecosystems and fish communities. So it's really easy to tell people, oh yeah, sure, get rid of your cattail, because they're very happy to do that. But it's really not about the cattail removal. It's about the restoration of native plants, right? If you think back to the beginning photos from my talk of those different types of plants sharing space, that's what's important for these fishes. If you don't have plants, you don't have spawning substrate, you don't have substrate for food, things like aquatic bugs to grow. So it's really this restoration message that we are trying to get out to the public, more than just sort of cattail removal. And you can see some photos here of us hosting some field events. We did this on Big Marine and a couple of other lakes, where we brought community members out to the lake. We showed them what we collect in our traps, and you can see out here, this is Brendan Nee, our grad student who worked on the fish component of the project. We brought everyone out on the boat, and the Maestert crew brought out their boat, and took everyone to our site so they could really see what we were doing. And we talked about the effects of cattail removal and the importance of restoration of native plant communities. Future research. So hopefully this research will continue for a couple of more years. Our plans are to monitor cattail regrowth and what maintenance is required to sustain these openings. So, there is going to be maintenance, especially when you have water level change and drought and flood. So that's something I think it's important to do. How much maintenance does this require from year to year? we want to get a better handle on fish use of these cattail openings. In our first summer after cattail removal, sometimes there would be a lot of algae or a lot of detritus in these areas. So I think once the cattail opening has persisted for more than 1 year, fish might use it differently. So we'll be continuing to monitor that. And we're also adding a new type of site to our lakes. Remember, we had cattail retained and cattail removed. We didn't include an uninvaded site, sort of a native plant site. So we're going to include an uninvaded plot in a number of our lakes. So we can see if removing cattails sort of approximates an uninvaded state. I would guess it wouldn't, but maybe it will be intermediate, right? You'll have the sort of native region, the uninvaded, and the cattail invaded. So that'll be an interesting component, I think, as well. I always show this picture of a technician of mine from some Great Lakes work with this muskrat mound. We found tons of muskrats using our cattail openings. They don't seem to be able to get into the really dense cattail, but once you open it up, they don't really care if it's native or hybrid. They will use it. So that's always an interesting component that I've never studied but have noticed. So with that, I just want to introduce you formally to our graduate students, Mike Tuma in the red hat and Brendan Nee in the sunglasses. Mike worked on plants, Brendan worked on the fish component. Couldn't have done this project, obviously, without their really hard work and really dense, difficult cattail. And we had two great undergraduates from the University of Minnesota Duluth, Kaylin Schmidt and Dylan Don. These photos were taken 1 year apart. They were doing the exact same thing, which is recording plant data as Mike is sampling plants. So was really critical to have this field crew. With that, certainly thanks to the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund and MACERC for funding our project. We also partnered with Voyageurs National Park and the Minnesota DNR, so they were both super helpful to getting this project done. Voyageurs did a bunch of our cattail removal in Rainy and Cab. And if you want to find out more, there's of course the MACERC website. There's the Minnesota Sea Grant website. We post updates to this project pretty frequently, and you can always shoot me an email. So with that, I am happy to answer any questions. Thanks.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Amy. You did cut out, so I was just you cut out twice, but I think we caught the first one. If you could just actually revisit your walleye slide where you were talking about the differences graphically, just between, I think we lost the majority of that one.
Was it this one?
You go one more back. Hang on.
Sorry, I saw it
and Yep. So at that Venn diagram, kind of in that transition is about when we lost.
Okay. Yeah, that's where I got the little sign that said your internet is unstable. So, so let's see. These are the different species we found. And you can see we found a few species in the removed plots we didn't see in the retained plots. And so suggesting here that the community shifted. And what I'm showing you here is minnows. And the reason let me explain the graph first, and then I'll explain why minnows are important. So again, this is just minnow abundance on the y-axis. And you've kind of seen these graphs before. And what we see here is that minnow species are similar before we remove or minnow abundance is similar before we remove cattail. Again, the values are super low. We remove cattail, and we see increases in minnow species in our cattail remove plots. So once we remove cattail, we see a few more minnow species. Turns out there's significantly more, but it's still a small number. So what I think is important about this is that minnows as a group, there's lots of different species of minnows, but as a group, they're those small-bodied species that live near shore. They're super important as forage or diet for game fish. So when people study what game fish eat, things like walleye, and they open up their stomachs or they look in their diet, what they see is it's mostly minnows. It's not small sunfishes that they're eating. So I think what happens is when we remove cattail, it makes it better for minnows. Minnows are a schooling species, so to avoid predation, they school together, whereas a small sunfish will hide in the vegetation. That makes them kind of unavailable to a predator. But minnows tend to be more available because they kind of swim around the edges of the vegetation. So I think that's really important. And so if we're losing minnow species, or if minnows are moving away from areas where cattail have invaded, that can have ramifications up the food chain for our game fishes. How's that?
Wonderful. Thanks for recapping that.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for asking me to. I appreciate it.
We do have just a question for clarification on the study area. Was wondering if that was narrow leaf, native, or a combination of both of them? both species?
Yeah, it would all be hybrid cattail. It would be hybrid cattail. Yeah, and hybrid cattail back crosses. So it's variable, but where we were studying was in hybrid cattail.
In your opinion, do you think that there's a chance that our native cattails will disappear as a result of the hybrid cattail invasion?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's possible. So one of the things that we know happens is that when you have that overlap in range, those species will always hybridize. So there's some people who think that actually that could drive our native cattail to extinction. I don't think there's any real evidence of that yet, but it is something that people do worry about, that you'll end up just with the hybrid all over rather than any pockets of native species. There are pockets of native species around. You see it, but there are folks who think that could be a possibility in the future.
I know I was thinking about this when I saw your presentation and the amount of mass of catfish or cattails that you're removing and how heavy, how labor intensive that is. That's a lot of work. And what are you guys doing with that biomass that you're physically removing from the lake?
Yeah, that's an important question as well. It really depends on the lake. So in some lakes, it depends on what property you're on, and we were mostly on public property in most places. So certain lakes had the regulation where when we removed cattail, we had to move it out of the basin, like out of the watershed of the lake. Part of the reason for that is that when you pile cattail on shore, as it decays, it's going to leach vegetation or leach nutrients back into the lake. So to avoid sort of like a negative feedback loop, right? You're taking that vegetation out, but yet the nutrients are leaching into the lake. They required us to move it out of the watershed. In some cases, they were okay with us piling it on shore. It's one of the real issues for large scale cattail removal is there's so much biomass. One interesting thing they do in Voyageurs National Park is they're a park, so they have a lot of sort of latitude with what they do, and they can when they cut all that cattail, they pile it up on shore to smush down the rest of the cattail, and they actually reseed it with native vegetation to try and get native vegetation to grow back. But it is definitely a problem. I can stop sharing my screen there probably.
No, you're good. Do you know as far as all that cat leaf or gosh, I can't say cat fish, cat
I know.
tail, cat leaf. I don't know what word's coming out. Are there any beneficial uses for the litter that's removed? I mean, can we burn it? How is it going to help with compost? Like what are some of the options?
Yeah, so there's that. There, as I said, Voyageurs does use it as sort of like a nutrient source for reseeding native plants. There have been studies where folks have tried to like pelletize it and burn it for biomass, or burn it or use it for biogas production. So there are possibilities. The big sticking point, I think, is how you get the stuff you remove to the place where you want to deal with it, right? Trucking it is super expensive, and of course, not carbon neutral. So there are things of how to biomass to the place where you might want to use it versus, oh, I can see I'm unstable again.
We got most of it.
Oh, okay, yeah. The problem is moving it. So there are uses, burning and biogas production, but again, the problem of moving it to where you want to go.
Let's see. We just had another question pop in. Is it possible for an amateur botanist to distinguish the hybrid from the narrow leaf in the field? Maybe
So
turn off
I'm
your
not going to
video.
give you 100% yes. I'm going to turn off my video.
There we go.
Okay. So I can't give you 100% yes. Are you still hearing me, Maddie?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, good. Good. So not 100% yes, but I would say looking at you're going to almost always end up with a hybrid. So that's where it's hard to know. Looking at that male and female part of the plant and whether they touch or not will tell you whether or not it's native. And when you really need to look at how it's growing. Native cattail grows nicely with other plants, right? It plays nicely with other plants. You see different plants growing. It doesn't really take over. If you have space between the male and female part of the plant and a really sort of dense stand, then that's probably the hybrid. Um, and that's most likely what you have. There's not a lot, you don't see a lot of pure narrowleaf, although I suppose you could. And that pure narrowleaf will always have a big space between the male and female part of the plant, if that's helpful.